be here today. I just celebrated a family wedding, my eldest son, Mazel Tov, to all of us. So very happy about that, and glad to be not on my phone, but on the computer this time. And today I wish to discuss with you sects and parties. That's not sex and parties, but religious sects and political parties in Judea, Galilee, Palestine, Eretz Israel, in what's called sometimes the Second Temple period, the time of Jesus. And what's interesting about this period, we talked a little bit last time about Jesus's sort of connection with the Hebrew Bible, how Jesus had no New Testament, how the stories of the Hebrew Bible in their particular, with their particular attention to human-human interaction and their prioritization of personal responsibility and the reflection of the lack of personal responsibility on the part of protagonists from Adam and Eve through Abraham, let's say, and the necessity of personal responsibility is very important. And today I want to sort of paint for you a picture of what was going on religiously and politically in this very exciting space, Eretz Israel, both in the south, Judea, in the north, Galilee, and in the general area which was called by the Romans Syria Palestina, and I'll explain that in a second. I wanted to add something from the end of last time, which is we talked about the idea of Hebrew scriptures inculcating in a person who would be prepared to hear the message, a message of taking responsibility, right? So God says to the first human, right, Adam, where are you? Of course, God knows where Adam is, right? But means the way a parent says to a child, where are you? Right? And Adam says, well, this woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate it. And the woman says, well, this serpent duped me, right? Or then Cain and Abel, right? Cain kills Abel. God says to Abel, Cain, where's your brother Abel? Cain says, is it my responsibility? Well, yes, it is actually, right? Or Noah, right? God says to Noah, I'm going to destroy the whole world. Noah says, fine, as long as I'm okay in the boat, right? Then we come to Abraham, and Abraham manages to extend himself in an extraordinary way to people he doesn't know, right? 3 dusty strangers in the road, or a bunch of people, probably evil people in the cities of the plain, right? But when it comes to his own family, the story is less sanguine. He sometimes prefers to hear the voice of God, the voice of his wife, the voice of others, directing him in terms of what he does with his family, and that's problematic. And I was thinking about this one more incident, which I didn't really mention, which is the story of Moses, several junctures, but one particular juncture didn't bring up last time, where Moses and the people of Israel are standing between the sea and the Egyptian army behind them, right? And it's a very scary position, and Pharaoh is approaching, and Moses is praying to God. And God says, Mati tzakalai, tabero b'nei Israel v'yisau. Why are you shouting at me? Moses, right? The greatest Jew ever is praying. Can you imagine what, you think about your prayer, right? Moses' prayer. And what does God hear? God hears shouting. God says, why are you shouting at me? Mati tzakalai daber. Don't shout, first of all, speak. Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to go forward. So even God is saying, look, I can do for you, but what's important is that you inculcate a situation where the people understand that you're caring for them and that you express your care to the people and you give them chizuk, you give them strengthening. So this humanism is very, very important. All right. Moving to this area, what we know now is the land of Israel. It's an interesting geographical area. It's called, for us, the land of Israel because God in the Bible vouchsafes it to the children of Jacob, who is called Israel, the Israelites. But the Romans, in occupying that land, sought to erase the Jewish presence, even to the extent of nomenclature, right? So they referred to this area as Greater Syria. right? Or the area that's below Syria, what was Syria on the map, which is similar to where Syria is today, as you know, the Middle East was divided up by the great powers with some sense of biblical history and ancient history. Or they called it Syria in the north, very far north, Palestina, right? Palestina. So the Palestine, the Philistines lived on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So what they said when they used the term Palestina was, they said, we want to refer to this land that is between the northern pagan area of Syria and the coastal pagan area of the Philistines. And it is that land, the Syria, Palestina, which cannot be named, like Voldemort, right? They refused to use the term Judea or Galilee, or, you know, they wanted to erase the name and presence of Jews, which is why for Jews of some political considerations, and I won't get into it, the idea, the use of the term Palestine, right? You know, either they'll say, people will say, well, we were Palestinians before there was a state of Israel, because that area was called by the British Mandate Palestine, and we lived there, and so we were the original quote unquote Palestinians. Or they'll say the use of Palestine by Palestinian Arabs is an attempt to erase the nomenclature of the state of Israel, right? But this is an old story, right? It definitely was in Roman times, and depending on your politics, you might extrapolate one thing or another to contemporary times. So it's a very interesting place. It's a place that has not only distinctions and diversity among the various religious sects and political parties, but it has, as America at the time of the Civil War, and even now, distinct flavor of northernness and southernness, right? Because there were two kingdoms, the kingdom of Judea in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north, and they were well nigh incompatible in terms of their cultural capital. So the south was a place of learning. It was a place of wealthier people, of elites. It centered around the sanctuary areas of Jerusalem, right? It comprised the Dead Sea, where various kinds of ascetics, self-deniers, monastic type people, and mystics hung out. And the north, in the Galilee, although now just an hour away by car very easily, was, because of the considerations of travel, an extraordinarily far off place. And it was up there that various folk healers lived, and various mystics, and various how would you say it, herbalists and healers. And for instance, just to give an example, if in the south in Judea there was a drought, right? What people would do is they would go and make offerings in the temple, or they would pray for rain, right? With the leaders of the place and time, and we'll talk about who those were in a second. In the north, if there was a drought, they would do the same kinds of things, but they couldn't go to the temple too far. In fact, there's some speculation that in spite of the biblical mandate that people appear 3 times a year in the temple in Jerusalem, that it was too far for many people in Galilee to come 3 times a year. Maybe they came once, maybe they didn't come at all, right? So the temple was, distant from them. And so they would pray. They would take the Torah scrolls out into the street and pray for rain, right? But it might be that you would have some extraordinary religious personalities who might do things like Choni HaMa'agel, Choni the circle maker, like draw a circle, a magic circle around himself and sit in it and address God and say, Tate, Daddy, Abba, Avinu Shemayim, our Father in heaven, right? I am not, do you love me? You love me. You love Choni, right? Very pious guy, right? You love me. I'm not leaving this circle until you send rain. Right? This is a very different kind of spirituality, very different kind of religious connection. Now, Jesus came from the north. The gospel writers situate his birth and his conception in the south because they are very concerned with doing something which we call foreshadowing, right? They want to make, and they are also connecting the Hebrew Bible, what they call the Old Testament, with this new set of literary narratives called the Gospels. And so they want to show that whatever was quote unquote predicted, or whatever happened in the Hebrew Bible, has a reflection and a quote unquote fulfillment in the new Christian scriptures. And so because King David was born in Bethlehem, and King David's descendants were the kings and queens of Israel, and King David's descendant would ultimately be the Messiah, right? Would ultimately be the new anointed king, in spite of the Roman occupation that Jews were hoping for, right? Who would redeem them from Roman occupation. That person should also be born in Bethlehem. So the Gospels construct this story that describes how Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and they eventually make their way up north, right? Historians of the Gospels say it's entirely plausible, and in fact likely, that Jesus was born in Nazareth in the Galilee. And so Jesus comes from that circle-making, herbalist, healing culture. Jesus comes from that culture that's already doing things outside of the temple, that turns toward the temple every day in prayer and recalls it and thinks about it, but you might not get down there so often. It's like the Wild West, right, of religion for Jews. And there's extraordinary diversity, both in the North and in the South. And it's that diversity I want to talk about today, I want to address. But we do have a problem. And that problem is that when we read the Gospels, all of which were written between 90 and 100 and more years after the events, and all of which were written by people who were already within the ambit of early Christianity. They might have had origins in Judaism, but the gospel writers themselves, even if they present themselves that way, were, it is agreed, not Jews. They'd already sort of crossed the line. The ways had begun to depart. And so they have some agenda, and they also have some lack of memory. And so in the Gospels, when Jesus's relationship with the other groups around him is described, it's tinged already with a generally anti-Jewish sentiment, which tends to set Jesus apart rather than reconciling him with and integrating him into the world in which he actually existed. And you see this with all kinds of constructions of hagiography, saintly biography, right? Stories of man-gods, right? The writers are concerned from the earliest instantiation to remove the person from context and make them special, and make it that person against the Welt, the world. And that's indeed what we see in the Gospels. Jesus is quoted as saying, "You scholars and Pharisees, you imposters, damn you. You're like whitewashed tombs. On the outside, they look beautiful, but inside they're full of bones and every kind of decay. So you look like upright people on the outside, but on the inside you do nothing but posture and subvert the Torah. You scholars and Pharisees, you imposters, damn you! You build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the just, and claim, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we wouldn't have joined in spilling the prophets' blood. So you witness against yourselves. You're descendants of those who murdered the prophets. You're the spitting image of your ancestors. You serpents, you spawn of Satan. How are you going to escape Gehenna's judgment?" Wow. Scholars, sometimes translated scribes, right? And Pharisees, sounds pretty dire. Pharisees, right? Imposters, damning them, comparing them to tombs, and saying they're no better than their ancestors who killed the prophets, and that they're the spawn of Satan. Who is Jesus talking about? Are these people friends, colleagues, or, as it seems, enemies. Well, here's the thing. Who do you argue most with? Who do you argue most with? You don't argue with people on the complete end of the political, social, religious spectrum, because there's no point. You're not going to convince them not to vote for X, right? You're not going to convince them to do or not do some kind of act, right? You argue with the people closest to you. Jews are good at this. I won't claim that they're the best at this, but they're pretty damn good, right? You remember the old story of the Jewish man on the desert island, right? They pick him up after 40 years on the desert island, and he shows them his corral where he keeps his goats and his pond where he does his fishing, and then he brings them into this huge clearing, and there's a beautiful building, and they say, what is that? Columns, pediments, right? He says, that's my shul, that's where I go to daven, it's my synagogue, I go to pray there. And then they turn around, and there's another huge building, columns, pediments, etc. And they say, what's that? He says, that's the shul I would never go to. Right? That's a synagogue I would never pray in, right? So Jews are good at creating divisions within themselves, right? Imagine there might be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 Jewish groups in any Jewish community. A lot of them are basically the same folks, right? Often they're not deeply religiously observant, but they get together because they're Jews, right? They're progressive, they're liberal. But some want a slightly different experience than others, and vice versa, or have slightly different attitudes toward Israel, or have slightly different attitudes toward, religious observance, right? They will fight. They will really, really fight. I mean, as much as cats and dogs, or more like cats and cats. As we'll see in a second. So I'm showing you, by the way, some of the synagogues in the north here, Kfar Nahum, and I think it's Baram, I'm not sure. Somebody will doubtless identify it. So these have been reconstructed from what was found on the ground. Of course, they're mowing, so I will shut my window, right? So, Jewish communities internally will fight like cats and cats, sorry, Ari, over relatively small things that become hugely significant, over anti-Semitism. Is it, being trivialized? Is it not enough being done? Is it being overstated? Occupation, right? Even the threat of death is not stronger than these disagreements. At the time of Jesus, in Eretz Israel, in Roman-occupied Palestine, there were a large number of religious sects and political parties, right? Now, the politics side, you may understand, right? It's a famous debate. Actually, here, indulge me for 1 second here. This is from Monty Python's Life of Brian. See if you can hear it.
Got any nuts? I haven't got any nuts, sorry. I've got wren's livers, badger spleen.
No.
Otter's noses?
I don't want that Roman rubbish.
Why don't you sell proper food?
Proper food?
Yeah, not those rich imperialist tidbits.
Oh, don't blame me. I didn't ask to sell this stuff.
All right, bag of Otter's noses then.
I did too.
2. Thanks, Freddie. Are you the Judean People's Front? Fuck off.
What?
Judean People's Front. Well, the People's Front of Judea. Judean People's Front.
Wankers. Can I join your group?
Now, piss off.
I didn't want to sell this stuff. It's only a job. I hate the Romans as much as anybody.
Are you sure?
Oh, dead sure. I hate the Romans already.
Listen, if you wanted to join the PFJ, you'd have to really hate the Romans.
I do.
Oh, yeah, how much?
A lot.
Right, you're in. Listen, the only people we hate more than the Romans are fucking Judean People's Front.
The Judean Popular People's Front.
Oh,
and the People's Front of Judea. The People's Front of Judea. Splitters.
We're the People's Front of Judea.
Oh, I thought we were the Popular Front.
People's Front. What happened to the Popular Front? Eh? He's over there.
Okay, so you see, what sectarianism, breaking into groups has to do, right? Now, how do we know about the groups that existed in Eretz Israel at this time, whether the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine or the Popular People's Front or the Judean People's Front? We know from a couple of writers. One was a fellow named Philo of Alexandria, who wrote, who included in his general world history some tidbits about these groups. But most of the information we have comes from the famous historian and traitor, Flavius Josephus. He was a historian and military historical writer and military leader. He fought against the Romans during the First Jewish-Roman War as the head of Jewish forces in the north. He surrendered 67 of the Common Era to the Roman forces led by Vespasian. He defected to the Roman side, was granted Roman citizenship, and became an advisor and friend of Vespasian's son Titus, who destroyed the temple of Jerusalem, right? He served as Titus's translator, right? From Latin to Greek or Latin to Aramaic when Titus led the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70. He is someone who should be pasula edus, should be unfit for witnessing because he was such a turncoat. But actually, his historical materials seem to have a lot of veracity and a lot of there's a lot of historical corroboration. For instance, he describes the temple in Jerusalem in great detail, and in all the details of the description, those details accord both with what the Mishnah says about how the temple was constructed and with archaeological finds. So, for instance, he says that there was a sarig, there was a boundary line around the temple, a fence around the temple, and on the fence was written in Greek, anyone who transgresses this boundary and is not a Jew is liable for the death penalty. And in fact, excavating the Temple Mount, that such inscriptions were discovered, two of them. One is now in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, and one is now in Turkey, because Turkish archaeologists and British archaeologists. And so he is generally regarded as quite reliable. Josephus, by the way, writes about Jesus, but the passage about Jesus with particular amplifications, saying, well, he was maybe more than a man, and perhaps some said he was the Son of God. All of those are interpolations by later Christian historians. The oldest manuscripts of Josephus do not have the mentions of Jesus as an extraordinary person, although Jesus is mentioned, it seems, by Josephus, and other messiahs, we'll talk about this, of the period are mentioned as well. He wrote two extensive works. One called The Jewish War, recounts the Jewish revolt against the Roman occupation, right? Caesar, the Jews are revolting. I know they're revolting, but they're the only Jews we have. Okay, so the Jews revolt against the Roman occupation around 75 of the Common Era. Terrible, terrible war, and Josephus was obviously involved and writes first-hand accounts. And the other was his Antiquities, the history of the world from a Jewish perspective for an ostensibly Greek and Roman audience, written a little bit later in his career. And Josephus describes 4 groups of Jews living at the time of Jesus who have different religious concerns and also different political sensibilities. Now, in the Antiquities, he writes about them rather briefly. In the Jewish War, he goes on more extensively. I'm just going to take the text of the Antiquities now because it's easier to get through and to understand. So he says that the Jews for a while had 3 groups of philosophy, meaning religion, particular to themselves. The sect of what he calls the Essenes, the sect of the Sadducees, the Tzedukim, and the third sort of opinions of those called Pharisees, Perushim, of which sects I have already spoken the second mark of the Jewish War, he says, but I'm going to summarize here for you. So he goes on and describes each of these groups. The Pharisees living frugally, right? And despise fancy diet. They're rationalists. They do what they think is reasonable. He tries to describe these groups in terms of the way Romans would describe philosophical sects. The Pythagoreans are vegetarian, they are rationalists, they believe that everything is according to number and order, right? So he describes, each of these groups in quasi Roman philosophical terms. Pharisees, Sadducees, and he describes, what they believe. The soul dies when the body dies. They only observe what is written directly in the Torah, whereas the Pharisees do something else. We'll see that in a second. And what their relation to the Pharisees are. He describes the Essenes and their idea that of determinism, that everything's in the hand of God. They are outside of the temple system. They are ascetics living in the desert. We'll talk about them in a second. And then finally, he talks about a fourth group, which actually it's more complex than he describes, but these people are zealots. These people are basically political activists. He doesn't describe their religious affiliations or philosophies at all. He just says that if there are Romans around, they are for killing the Romans, and so he describes these four groups. Now, their beliefs and practices can be summarized this way, and we'll talk about the fourth sect on its own. Okay, the Pharisees. Well, let's start with the Sadducees. Okay, the Sadducees were, according to Josephus, and we see this reflected in Jewish literature too, the sort of centerpiece, the establishment, if you would, of Jewish life. These were the priests who worked in the temple, the descendants of Zadok, the Sadducite priest, right? And they were aristocrats. They lived in Jerusalem around the temple. Their figures of authority were the priest, the high priest, whose line goes back to Zadok, and beyond that to Aaron, right? They were, being the establishment, highly Hellenized. They spoke Greek. They allied with the Romans because the Romans were that military force that was capable of guaranteeing the safety of the temple, which was their workplace. They opposed the usurpation of the priesthood by other groups. So remember, at the time of the Hanukkah story, there are the Hasmoneans. This is priestly group that rises up and routs the other Jews who were assimilationists and starts their own thing and continues supposedly the priesthood, but in a new line, the Hashmonaim. The Tzaddokites are against them. And then in terms of their theology, they believe that human beings have free will. They don't believe in angels, and they don't believe in an afterlife. Very interesting, because as we'll see, mainstream Judaism, which does not owe its origins to the Stukim, to the Sadducees, has different attitudes both toward angels and to afterlife. They were, and it's understandable, the literal guardians of the literal written Torah. They were the ones who made sure that the Torah was written as it had always been written. They were called, those people within the group were called scribes, the Sophrim, and they preserved the text of the written Torah, and they totally rejected the idea that one could deviate from or interpret the law. Now, every group who desires to do this, of course, creates its own system. And so the Tzaddokites had their own system based on how they read the law, which was essentially a non-literal or oral Torah, but they disavowed themselves. They removed themselves from the idea that they were creating such a system, although they did create such a system. They had their jobs in the temple, right? The temple was the central element for religious life. They were the religious functionaries, right? And they maintained a lunisolar calendar, although they desired to have a calendar that was exclusively lunar, according to the Torah. So in the Torah's calendar, right, it's a lunar calendar, and the holidays could theoretically move around the calendar as Ramadan does in Islam. But at this period in time, there was a serious correction of the calendar so that Passover always fell in the spring. And so the calendar was corrected for a solar calendar, and the Sadducees reluctantly accepted that calendar because that's what people did. Okay. That's the Sadducees, the establishment. They're all the way there on that left-hand column. In the right-hand column, we have the Essenes or ascetics, all the way on the right hand. Right? This includes a group of people whose remains have been found in Qumran, that is the Dead Sea Scrolls, literature that was copied by Jews who lived in the desert. We don't know the origin of the name Isim. Maybe it comes from the idea of healers. They might have been founded by separationist Sadducees. They were not elite because they were ascetic, because they denied comfort, because they denied wealth. But as you know, right, there are plenty of people in this world who are able to do that because they come from luxury. The Buddha is a good example, right? He came from luxury. He denied the body. He denied, anything that was material. And so the theory is that they were founded by separationist Sadducees. They had a figure of authority who had not arrived. That person was called the Moret Tzedek, the teacher of righteousness, and they thought of this person as a future kind of redeemer of the corrupt system, the system of the cities, the system of Roman occupation and collaboration, the system even of the temple. They envisioned a future temple that would be a very different place than the current temple in the first century, which was an institution that depended on political alliances. They saw things differently. Many of them were vegetarians. They had opinions about animal sacrifice, right? And of course, they were against the Roman occupation, right? They really did not like the Hasmoneans, but neither did they like the Tzadokite priests who were in the temple. They lived in the desert, near the shores of the Dead Sea, in caves, in a communal, for some, monastic kind of existence. So when you think of monasteries with monks living together and living under a rule and keeping company with each other and forming spiritual community and copying manuscripts, all those things come from the Jewish ascetics in the first century. Those ideas made their way into Christian monasticism, right? They were totally Calvinist. That is, they believed that everything that happened was totally God-determined, and there was nothing, says Josephus, that human beings could do to alter their fate, right? They did believe in angels. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about angels, and in fact, human beings who become angelic, like Enoch and Elijah. And they understood that when one died, there was some form of spiritual survival, that the soul, somehow resided with God, as they put it. The priests, the Sadducees, said, nope, when you're dead, right? There's nothing after death, right? They were very material in this world. The Essenes had some sort of spiritual idea of spiritual continuity, right? They interpreted scripture in such a way as it seemed to foretell recent history. Now, when I talk to you about foreshadowing in the New Testament, or the Greek scriptures, taking things from the Hebrew Bible, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, and saying that they pointed to events in the life of Jesus, the Essenes did similar things. They read scripture as pointing to the contemporary religious, political, sectarian situation of their lives. They, like the Sadducees, developed their own body of interpretation of extra-biblical traditions, and they were very, very distinctive in the interpretation of Torah law, very much interested in purity, in separating themselves from anything that could come into contact with anything impure. They were communistic, they shared property, they were often celibate. It seems that there were some non-celibate groups, but these were monks, Jewish monks, essentially, or Christian ascetics were Christian Jewish monks, right? Because they took on these practices eventually. And they had a completely solar calendar, right? So you have the Sadducees, temple functionaries, the establishment. You have the Essenes, hippies running around the desert, doing what they would, separate from the temple and separate from that culture, thinking about the dawning of a new age, the age of Aquarius. And then squarely in between, you had a group that was very radical, but actually created a system that could survive. And this is crucial. When the temple was destroyed, there were no jobs for Sadducees. End of Sadducee Judaism. When the Romans conquered the land, there was no hope for the Essenes, right? When the temple was destroyed, when Jews were exiled, no hope for the Essenes. Their dreams had come to an end. No more Essenes, just the scrolls remaining in caves in the desert. But one group had the wherewithal to continue Judaism, and they were the Prushim. Prushim, Pharisees, may come from, it means people were separated, maybe because they had high standards of purity, which we'll discuss as we go along, but maybe because they had separated from the temple priests, and they had the hearts, as Josephus puts it, of the people. The majority of Jews in Jesus' time came from the group of the Prushim. Their figures of authority were not priests in the temple and not messiahs of the desert, but disciples of the wise, Talmidei Chachamim. And this meant that there was a democratization of Judaism, that it was no longer in the hands of a hereditary class, and it wasn't in the hands of people who had abstract theological and mystical experiences in the desert. It was in the hands of anyone who could study Torah. As such, they had a varied stance toward the occupation. The truth is that they respected the temple, and it was the center of their thought while it stood, right? But they were creating something that would exceed and outlive the temple. They looked at the temple and said, this is not an edifice that's going to last forever. We need to have portable, user-friendly form of Judaism that we can take with us into whatever happens next, because it doesn't look good for us with the Romans, right? So they understood, and they wrote this, Ezehu Chacham, right? Haroes Hanolad. Who is wise? Not somebody who studied a lot of texts or that God revealed something to. A wise person is a person who sees the next thing, who sees the coming problem. And they did, right? They created a system in which one succeeded by learning Torah. They created sophisticated scholarly interpretations, applying Torah to all aspects of life, right? They developed an oral Torah, which they claimed was equal, very radical, to the written Torah. And they said that every chiddush, every new idea that was atid, was in the future would be mechadesh, would be promulgated, went back to the moment at Sinai, where God gave not only the written Torah, as the Sadducees said, but the rules and the laws and the hermeneutic principles for interpreting and understanding the Torah. And that's what gave the Torah legs. That's what means say the Pharisees, in the future, when something develops called electricity, and we need to determine whether we can use it on Shabbos or not, because the Torah says that you should not burn a fire on the Sabbath. How are we going to figure that out? Well, via this series, this system of laws given on Sinai as a sort of key or instruction manual to the book. Right? When the temple was destroyed, there was nothing more for the Sadducees to do. No sacrifices. Leadership didn't matter because the chain was broken. But the Pharisees had not only the book, but the key, and they could go on with those two things. They prioritized and democratized text study, as I said, but they also did something else. They were very smart. They said, this temple, not going to last, although it pains us. By the way, Jesus says the same thing, as we'll see in a second. Jesus says, this temple, not one stone will be on another stone. Right? That's not a prophecy. That's an observation of what life is under occupation. And when you're occupied, you need to make plans. And so what they started doing is saying, you know what? The priests in the temple, they make the sacrifices. They're in the presence of God all the time. But you know what? We're also in the presence of God because we have the Torah in our hands. And so just as the priests in the temple would wash their hands in a special way, a ritual way, beyond being clean, but they raised up their hands to God, nitilat yadayim, raising up their hands, so too we will do it in our houses. What do you mean? You're not priests. You may not be a priest, but my house is a temple and my table is an altar. And so when I eat at that table, I will raise up my hands just as the priests did in the temple. So they began to take things that were done in the temple and democratize them and bring them home. They held a lunar solar calendar because that's what the people did mostly. They believed in free will. They said, Hakol b'yedei shamayim chutz mirat shamai, right? Everything is in God's hands, but anything can be mitigated by one's personal connection with God. So God ultimately has control, but we have free will, and that's essential. They believed in angels because they read angels in the biblical text, and unlike the other two groups, they opted to believe in a physical resurrection at some time in the distant future. Not just that souls go back to God, the Essenes, or that nothing happens, the Sadducees. Now, you had three important groups. The fourth group was the Zealots. The Zealots went around stabbing Romans, right? And they had a very strong anti-Roman political agenda. Against the backdrop of this spectrum, let's say, Jesus, as we'll see, fits in one place and one place only. He's not a Sadducee. He's not a priest in the temple. He doesn't hold that the oral Torah has priority. He's always teaching and interpreting. He's not an ascetic. He's not living in the desert. Had he chose to join John the Baptizer, John the Dipper, who was, as we hear in the Gospels, running around the desert, wearing camel skin and eating locusts and wild honey, and proclaiming God's imperial rule was to come, and telling everybody to dip in a mikveh because we had to be pure, right? If Jesus had wanted to, he could have joined John's group, but he didn't. What did Jesus do? You know, the bracelet, WWJD, what would Jesus do? I always say, what would Jesus do? He'd probably be davening mincha around now. Okay, so what did Jesus do? He went around from place to place, and he taught Torah. If he came on Shabbos to a shul, and they were reading the Haftorah, he'd say something about it. He talked about resurrection, a general resurrection, and his own resurrection. He spoke about angels. He was sort of on the fence about the Romans, right? He hoped that the wicked Roman kingdom would come to an end, And in its place would be basilio tuteo, as he said in Greek, God's imperial rule, malchuta dishmaya, rule by heaven rather than rule by Caesar. Yet on the other hand, when people said, should we pay taxes to the Romans? He said, what do you have in your pocket? And he said, well, I have a coin. He says, oh, actually 2 coins. He says, show them to me. So they show him one, and it's a denarius with the emperor's head on it. And they show him the other one, and it's a shekel with the image of the temple on it. And he says, give Caesar what's due to Caesar, and give God what's due to God, right? So he was like the Pharisees, someone who wasn't a collaborationist with the Romans. No, he was executed for being an insurrectionist, in fact, but he wanted to accomplish his mission. And his mission was teaching Torah. And his mission was interpreting Torah. And whether you like his interpretations or not, one thing is clear. There was not halacha as we have it now in this period. And so if he says things and he does things, we have to understand that it's not like today where we have particular laws about what's acceptable and not acceptable on Shabbos. Shabbos was in development, and he was right in there. His interpretations, of course, were more to a humanistic side, but that's okay. He's part of the spectrum. He's part of the fellowship. And what the authors of the Gospels did not understand is that when you, one second, I just want to get rid of this. 1 second. I want to stop sharing. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Stop sharing.
At the bottom, yes, Mark, at the bottom.
Right, I got it. So one of the things the authors of the Gospels did not understand is that, yeah, Jesus had a beef with the priests in the temple. You know why? Because the Pharisees had a beef with the priests in the temple. Moreover, Jesus had a beef with, let's call them the other Pharisees. He had a beef with the other Pharisees because that's what Jews do. They argue with people with whom they basically agree about points which to the outsider will seem trivial. Jesus, after all, said, and this seems to be an authentic statement of his, by the criterion of embarrassment, that is something that's included in the Gospels that really contradicts a lot of what later Christianity says, but was obviously left in there because it was an authentic statement. Jesus says, look, it's not my job. I didn't come here to change even the smallest letter, a yod, or even a crown. You know how in the Torah scroll, some letters have little crowns, decorations on them. Even the decoration on top of the letter, right? My job is to fulfill this, to make it understandable, right? Christians say to fulfill means I've come instead of the Torah, but there's no reason to think that that's what he's saying, right? He's upholding the Torah, but he's upholding the interpretation of the Torah. And so of all these sects and parties in this period, we can say indisputably that Jesus was closest to the Prushim, not a priest, not an ascetic, but an interpreter of Torah. And it's to the interpretations that he made that we will turn as we proceed. But first, an interlude. Jesus came from the north. He was not only interested in teaching Torah. In fact, you might think that that's more of an intellectual thing. It's more of a something for people from the south. After all, when Rebbe Meir's very intelligent wife, Bruria, met with a quote-unquote scholar from the north, Rebbe Yossi, she was very summary to him, right? Rebbe Yossi meets Bruria on the road, and he says, pardon me, madam, could you kindly tell me the way to Lod, which is a town near contemporary Tel Aviv in the north, in the south. And she looks at him and she says, silly rabbi. No, that's silly rabbit. Tricks are for kids. No, she says, you Galilean moron. Don't you know that you shouldn't have said, pardon me, madam, can you kindly, you should just say, which way to Lod? And when he looks at her perplexed, she says, because after all, the sages have taught us, do not increase conversation with a woman. So she's both criticizing the sages for saying something that's stupid, right? But also saying that because he's this Galilee tipshi, this guy from the north, he knows nothing about law or halacha. So we'll find out that Jesus did have some ideas about law and how it should be prosecuted. But most importantly, for a lot of the people around him, he was a figure like Choni HaMa'agel, Choni the circle maker. Remember him? I'm not leaving this circle until you stop raining, right? He was a person who healed. He was a person who was involved in what we called folk healing and, like many other rabbis of his time, in miraculous types of healing. And it is to that we'll turn next time. And then into our last session, we'll talk more about his attitude toward nascent or developing halacha. But I see that, as my shrink says, our time is nearly up. So let's take some time for questions. And this time, I'll look at the questions in the chat and I will try to moderate them a bit. Okay. Okay. So upcoming programs. Thank you. Right. The Sadducees were Torah literalists, says Sarah, how they could not believe in angels. Because here's the thing, in the Torah, angels, first of all, we're talking about the question of whether angels come and meet with human beings. So the Sadducees, I think, understood that there was a divine world in which there were angelic beings. But every time an angel appears in the Bible, they appear as human beings. And so they say that the word malach, as opposed to the word kruv, cherub, or seraph, or fiery being, right? The word malach, said the Sadducees, simply means a messenger. And they saw these people as human messengers of God, okay? Were Chazal, says Anita, Prushim. Chazal were the eneklach of Prushim. The sages, Chazal, Chachamenu Zichronam Lebracha, our sages of blessed memory, were the eneklach, were the grandchildren of the Prushim. In other words, this idea that Torah study was the priority, and that's what made you a great person, right, to study Torah, and that leadership was not on the basis, we don't, Chazal, our sages, who traditional Jews, to whom traditional Jews owe their fealty, and to whom post-traditional Jews either accept or conflict with, right? But they form our Judaism today, whether we apply to it or we rebel against it. Them, right? They are the picture. Chazal were most definitely democratizers of the tradition through Torah. We don't have a tradition that there are people who are priests. What happened to the priests? They get in traditional shuls the first aliyah, the first calling up to the Torah, and certain other benefits, right? But they certainly don't, you're not automatically an important person in a community if you're a priest the way you are if you're a Torah scholar, right? In Pharisee democratization of text study, was it still confined to males? Yes, it was confined to males until the 19th century. So that's, that's just the way things were, unfortunately. Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher, says Mark Hager. Were most of the Pharisees apocalyptic at that time? No. There were two strands within Phariseeism. One was what we could call prophetic. That is, I look at the stories of the prophets in the Torah and I see them as moral exhortations, right? If you're good, then the lion will lie down with the lamb and blah, 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 and the swords will be beaten into plowshares. But if you're bad, woe to you, for the sword will pursue you, right? That's prophetic. Apocalyptic is, one day the lion will lie down with the lamb, and that day is coming soon. So you better fix your behavior, right? Not because you're going to live continuously in a good world, but because there's going to be a disjunction, a break, an apocalypse, and a new world is dawning. Some Prushim were of that inclination, perhaps influenced by some of the desert ascetics, right? And some Prushim were not. This is evidenced by the statement in the Gemara in which two rabbis are discussing what the redemption is going to look like. And one of them says it will dawn slowly, like sunrise, right? and that when it comes, in bein yimot ela yimot haMashiach ela shi'abud legoyim, that will look nothing different than the present age, except it will have sovereignty in the land of Israel, right? So it could be that this is the Messianic age, right? The other, interlocutor said, no, it's going to be kecheref ayin, it's going to be like the blink of an eye, it's not going to be a gradual dawn, and it's going to be apocalyptic, and fire is going to rain down on the wicked, blah, 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 right? So Jesus is more in that direction, it seems. So thank you for that. Were the Essenes the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls? There were many different desert sects, so it's possible that there were. Were there any Essene women? It seems that most people in Qumran at least, were ascetic. It seems also that there might have been monastic communities of Jews that had men and women, but we don't know much about that. Did different sects of the, thank you, Mary, and Jeffrey and Suzanne, did different sects celebrate holidays on different days? Yes, the Sadducees and the Pharisees had a conflict on the day of Shavuot, because it says that you begin to count the Omer, the days of particular offering, from Mimacharat HaShabbat, from after the Shabbat in the Torah. So the Pharisees said that Shabbat means the day of rest. So from after the first day of Passover, which is the first day of rest in the Omer cycle, you start counting 50 days. The Sadducees said, no, you have to wait till the next Shabbos. And so they ended up celebrating Shavuot on different days. But here's the thing. The Pharisees the Sadducees controlled the temple. So if you're going to bring your sacrifice on the right day, of course, there were conflicts. And there were conflicts over Yom Kippur and other things as well. Okay. If the Gospels were written after 90 or 100, why is the destruction of the temple not mentioned in them? Well, because they're written about the time before the destruction of the temple. So the Gospels aren't about the period of 90 to 100. They're about the period of 1 to 33. So Jesus says things like, I promise you, this thing is not going to, it doesn't have legs, this temple thing. It's destined for failure, right? That's the best you get. Okay. Suggestions for reading on Second Temple period topics, that will leave to Ari, who's very good at follow-up. Have I written any books? A bunch, but they're all crap. Was John the Baptist an Essene? It's not clear. He was one of those desert groups. Look, it's like People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Popular People's Front, right? If I asked you what was going on in Haight-Ashbury in 1969, the summer, 64, whatever, the summer of love, you'd say, oh, there were a lot of hippies, right? But if you had gone there, you would see there were all these different hippie groups, right? So John the Baptist was either an independent operator, which he seems to be, right? And there were such people, or he was a member of a group, we don't know which group, what name. Okay. And yes, James Nerlinger is correct in saying depends generally who. Okay. I am going to stop there. There's some more suggestions and questions in the chat, but this is great. And yes, thank you, Ahuva, right? Palestine as Palestine, right, was from 132, from the end of the Jewish War, but people, the Romans called the area Syria, Palestine before that. Okay. Yes, I have many thoughts on those, but I think it's probably time.
I think, yeah, it's a great place to stop. Thank you very much, Mark. Enjoyed it very much, and I'm reminding you all that we'll send out in a day or two the links, and also you will be able to access the previous lecture because people have asking, and we'll send out a few names of books and etc. etc. So hopefully you'll get that in a few days' time, and we hope to see you all next week on Wednesday. Same time and place.
See you around.
Okay, have a great day.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.